Well, now let's drill down on state houses. Over to my colleague Reed Wilson, national correspondent of The Hill. He is talking to Jessica Post, president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, where she is responsible for flipping red states to blue. Reed, take it away.
Hey, Bob, thanks so much for having me. And Jessica, I know we've got you here too. Jessica Post is the executive president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee after a long career in Democratic politics. Jessica, I want to start with just sort of the basics. Why should we be talking about state legislative races? We've got the White House on the ballot. Why do these down-ballot races matter so much?
Well, the building blocks of democracy are built in state legislatures across the country. Everything from voting rights, which has gotten a lot of debate, to how legislative lines and also congressional lines are drawn. Most of the issues that affect Americans' day-to-day lives are actually decided within state legislatures. And I think that's something many Americans may not understand, but it's so important, and there's so much at stake this year. As Democrats, we have a huge opportunity to take advantage of this great political environment with Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket and flip back more state legislative chambers red to blue.
You touched on the redistricting implications there. That takes on, obviously, a huge added factor in this year's election because this is the immediate pre-redistricting reapportionment cycle. Talk about that. How much of your focus is on the redistricting that's going to come after November?
Well, truly 20 years of power is on the line. This is the first time in 20 years that we've had both a presidential election where Democrats normally do better, and then we also have redistricting in 2021. Remember, in 2000, redistricting wasn't done in this sort of partisan way. It really was in 2010 where Republicans took surgical precision to redistricting, making sure that Democrats were packed into individual districts and some Democrats carved out in other places. So we have this huge ability in 35 states. State legislatures draw both the congressional and in many cases the state legislative lines. So 20 years of power in terms of drawing congressional districts for this decade, but also in this historic election in the middle of a global pandemic, we have this great opportunity to shift the balance back. Remember, President Obama, part of the reason he was unable to implement his agenda was because of a Republican-drawn Congress that happened in 2010. And it was difficult. Democrats, we almost gave Republicans a decade-long lease on Congress in 2010. And we just finally got it back. So it's a huge stakes in this election in terms of control of Congress for the next decade or even 20 years.
Yeah, and you talk about that, the election of 2010, where Republicans swept so much. I mean, even now, Democrats are still digging out of that hole. Republicans still hold 60% of the state legislative chambers across the country. Democrats only hold 40%. Where can you make inroads this year? What states should we be watching?
Well, remember, legislative chambers don't necessarily reflect the population. So we're nearing parity in terms of state house seats across the country. Wyoming is not California in terms of population. So I think we have great opportunities to flip the state legislative chamber in Arizona red to blue. We're only 2 seats down in the Arizona House and 3 seats in the Arizona State Senate. We have a great shot to flip the Minnesota State Senate, the Iowa State House, the Michigan State House, and both chambers in Pennsylvania, as well as the North Carolina chambers, and then the Texas House. We are also on our expansion map. We're looking at states like Georgia and Florida. So there's a lot of alignment between our targets and the presidential battleground. And if you look, Vice President Biden is doing extremely well in many of these state legislative districts. In some Western Pennsylvania districts, for example, he's at 60% of the vote. And those are districts we need to hold and win in order to flip the Pennsylvania House red to blue.
I want to zoom in on the biggest target that you just identified there, Texas, a state where Democrats haven't held the state house for a generation. I mean, we're talking about, Ann Richards' era since Dems held the House back then. You're 9 seats down in Texas. What are the types of districts you're targeting? Democrats obviously made significant inroads in U.S. House elections in 2018.
Well, Democrats also flipped a dozen state house seats in Texas in 2018 as well, making record progress. And that's really what sets us up for the success here in 2020 to flip 9 seats red to blue. There's been a huge shift in Texas in the suburbs and also a giant demographic shift in Texas as well. There's been what we are calling a Texodus, a retirement of a number of state legislators in the state, Republican state legislators. And those things are setting us up for victory in Texas. So in terms of the types of districts Reed. We're looking at places outside of Dallas and the Dallas suburbs, outside of Houston, outside of Fort Worth, and even some of the suburban areas, think Williamson County outside of Austin. So great opportunities across the state. There's quite a bit of overlap with the congressional target map and the targets that we see for ourselves at the DLCC.
And let's move to North Carolina now, another state where you've made inroads after I feel like a decade of litigation on redistricting issues. What are the pickup opportunities there?
There's great opportunities around Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, additional opportunities around Wake County in the Triangle, and then also out in Wilmington in coastal North Carolina. Great opportunities. The state Senate map slightly improved after the litigation. The state House map, we still are on a challenging state House map, but we certainly see a path to victory to pick up additional seats and flip both of those state legislative chambers. Remember, we only need to flip one chamber to have a lever of power in redistricting. Unfortunately, Democratic Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina can't veto maps, so we need to pick up one of those chambers to have a lever of power and a seat at the table for redistricting.
So that's interesting. In both Texas and North Carolina, you're fighting not to control the redistricting process, but just to get a seat at the table there. Can you talk a little bit about how much of a difference that makes, the difference between being at the table and being on the sidelines?
Well, yes, especially in Texas and in North Carolina, both states very famous, or I should say infamous, for gerrymandering. In Texas, you'll remember that mid-cycle redistricting happened, and Tom DeLay led Republicans to gerrymander maps even in the middle of the election cycle. So in terms of having a seat at the table, it makes sure that gerrymandering is not done in the dark of night. In many of these states, Democrats were completely kept out of the process, and the Republicans went into places called a bunker, a private hotel room. They engaged a private law firm, and really they made sure that there was no sunlight in the redistricting process. Now, if Democrats have a lever of power and a seat at the table, there will be a lot more public accountability. People will be able to analyze maps online, and will be able to have Democrats say, hey, that's not a fair map, and really shine light and provide accountability with their votes, but also with their ability to appeal to the public who really disapprove of gerrymandering and hold those Republicans accountable.
Broadly speaking, you've talked about some of the districts that you're going to target in Texas and North Carolina, and you see the pattern there, right? The suburban Dallas, suburban Austin, suburban Houston, suburban Wake County, Mecklenburg County. I mean, I'm sensing a trend here. It seems like across the country, the suburbs are going to be your best friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Republicans have had a complete erosion in the suburbs. They have lost power because of the Trump brand. And so as politics become sort of increasingly nationalized, people also are looking, and voters are looking at what the Republicans that are governing these states have done. And they've been very disappointing on COVID-19. It's been a fall down failure in both federal and state Republicans. And so as a result, the trend that has started in 2016 is continuing, where suburban voters continue to sort of flock our way. The other thing I would say in states like Iowa and Minnesota, we're going back to districts that had like old Democratic DNA. So think about towns like Cedar Rapids and Dubuque, where we can win back chambers, especially with Biden at the top of the ticket. That's also true in PA. We have to win back some of these small towns in Northeast Pennsylvania. And Biden is a great candidate at the top of the ticket, in addition to the incredible candidates we've recruited across the country to be standard bearers for our party.
You mentioned the coronavirus pandemic here. How is the pandemic changing the way a state legislative candidate campaigns? I mean, these are not campaigns that use, massive TV buys and things like that. How do you avoid making this just a referendum on somebody with a D or an R after their name?
That's a great question. One of our favorite campaigning methods at the state legislative level is knocking on doors and having that face-to-face conversation across the threshold of a person's house. It's just a lot of honesty. However, now in this time of COVID, we're trying to do things like virtual house parties where a candidate will show up doing sort of neighborhood-based organizing, where a candidate shows up in a virtual house party and has a conversation. We're also doing a lot of old school tactics like postcards, handwritten letters, and anything that we can do to provide that personal touch We're also continuing to focus on local issues. There's so many local issues in these elections. COVID is a local issue. And so we're talking about what are the things that these Democrats can do to serve their communities, and communicating with voters that they're willing to go into the state capitals and fight for the needs of their communities, whether that's traffic. You saw Danica Rome on the stage yesterday, the first transgender woman elected. She talked a lot about traffic in her campaign. And so these are really issues that are affecting the quality of life of most Americans. And it's something that's we think that we're going to bring to bear against the Republicans in the fall.
Are a lot of your candidates talking about the coronavirus pandemic as sort of a central part of their message? And are there states where that works better than others?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's many states where in Michigan, where we're trying to flip 4 state House seats to flip the state legislature red to blue. You saw Governor Whitmer on speaking at the convention last night. Republicans have been an ongoing thorn in her side. And so there we have an ally in a very popular Democratic governor whose efforts on COVID have been somewhat foiled by Republicans who continue to try to claw back some of her executive authority. So that's a place where we're talking about being an ally to a very popular governor. In other places, citizens are really furious about surging COVID races, or I should say surging COVID rates in their individual states. And in those places, we have a great ability to talk about a Republican single party response to COVID as a failure. And so those are places like Arizona, Texas, places that Republicans are solely responsible for the management of COVID in their state, and a place where we could see a dramatic change if we flip a state legislative chamber red to blue.
All right, Jessica Post, thank you so much. I'll throw it back to Bob.